You mentioned visualization and your work with the crew at Vesta Rowing Club, and you started off with that. Is that something that you use in your coaching now?
Yes. Yeah. Visualization is such a central key component of the psychological makeup of an athlete. And I think it's potentially one area where people could be skeptical, because a lot of people would think that there's no substitute for doing. So how can anything be better than practicing a skill? How can anything be better than practicing doing something for real? And actually, what we've learned is that there are lots of things that can be better. In fact, by relying too heavily on physical practice, we can sometimes dilute the quality with which our brain or our brain adapts to that skill. So you think that the role of a coach fundamentally uh, is to help rewire the brain of an athlete towards optimum performance. Now, that might sound quite scary, because most coaches wouldn't have ever considered that in what they're doing, they're rewiring an athlete's brain, this human being's brain. You're making them or helping them to think differently, act differently in order to achieve a different outcome. But that's exactly what we're doing. So I think psychology now is responsible for helping coaches understand the difference they're making in people's brains. And neuroscience has allowed us to come a long, long way. And really, it's because of, functional MRI scans and things like that, that we're starting to understand the power of techniques that up until now have really only been anecdotal, I suppose, in many ways. And visualization is one of those things. When we visualize, the brain uses exactly the same networks as if we were actually doing it. The difference is that we can control that better without the sort of extraneous influences around us getting in the way of the sort of purity of that skill. So through visualization, we can practice skills with a greater purity and therefore train our brain more effectively to learn how to do that skill. We can also train ourselves to do that skill in different environments. It's something called mood state congruence, but it allows us to adopt that skill at an Olympic final where we would have no other opportunity to do that. So the power of our imagination is essential for allowing us not only to accelerate the rate at which we learn new skills, but also to adopt those skills in high pressure situations where we wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity. So that for me is the key benefit and importance of visualization.
So,
Yeah.
how would you suggest that a coach can help their athlete with visualization? What's the
Mm.
process of you taking an athlete through that process?
So I think there are a few rules to visualization which it's worth bearing in mind. You mentioned there the type of visualization where you're looking at a screen of yourself, and sometimes that can be useful to when you need to almost detach yourself from the environment, but you need to kind of see yourself doing something, capable of doing something. But most of the visualization I would use was when you get an athlete to see themselves in their mind's eye. In other words, you're there doing it. I work a lot with equestrians, for example. So they would literally be there on the horse, and they would see what they see. They would feel what they would feel, the reins between their fingers, or, for a rower, it would be the feeling of the oar, in their hands, and the pressure of the oar as they pull back, the bounciness of when they push back. In fact, I think that's something we did with Vesta, was that they spoke about a kind of lightness in the feet, and how when they push back, there was a kind of effortless ease, a springiness to it. And springiness can be quite valuable in sports because it allows us to kind of use our natural physiology more effectively, our sort of proprioception, For tennis players, for example, so many of them, when you get them to describe their best ever performance, they'll talk about feeling a springiness, a lightness in their feet, which becomes a very important feeling to be able to reinforce and recreate in their visualization. So the first general rule I'd say is being able to see things in your mind's eye. You're actually there doing it. I would say one of the biggest mistakes, in some sports more than others, is that they speed visualization up. And the problem with that is that they actually reinforce the idea that things happen really quickly, especially when they're nervous. So they find themselves in competition and they struggle to maintain control of what they're doing because their heart rate is quicker than it normally would be. Their blood's pumping to their muscles. Their brain is much more attuned to what's going on. So it's like, you know, when we're using stress positively, we should be able to almost see things in slow motion because our brain is working so quickly relative to what's going on around us. We have that amazing time to think, time to act. And that's an incredible place to be. The thing is, we're only likely to achieve that if when we visualize being there, we visualize it at a relatively steady pace, realistic pace. If we're rushing round a course, for example, to thinking that we're visualizing, we're actually not. You know, we might be learning where to go or which direction to go in, but we're not actually visualizing. And we're encouraging our brain to rush. So that's the other thing I'd say about visualizing. If just to expand on this, if it's okay, James, I might share my own experience in visualization routine. Something that I did for my shooting when I was a pentathlete, because you see, shooting is one of those unbelievably annoying sports whereby you can learn how to shoot really well in training. You can hit the center of the target every single time. You get to competition, you're there on the first shots, and you're just wobbling. You're wobbling, and the more you're wobbling, the more you think about the fact that you're wobbling, which of course is taking your focus away from what you're trying to control or what you're trying to do well. So I very soon realized that practicing shooting was only going to get me so far. Just doing it was only going to get me so far. What I now had to do is train my mind to be able to do it perfectly in the conditions of competition. So how did I do that? It starts in training. You cannot suddenly apply new techniques to competition. It doesn't work like that. You know, you start trying to focus on something different and then you wonder why it goes wrong. So training stress and training our ability to perform under pressure starts in training. For me, I would turn up to training much earlier than I used to. So I would turn up maybe at least 15 minutes earlier. I would put my gun and pistol on the range, and I would sit back and I would sit in a chair behind the range, just like we're doing competition. I would then start just focusing on my breathing and just do some deep breathing, simple deep breathing. I would make sure that on every out breath, I was relaxing, and I would wait until I got to the point where my mind was much more still, much more calm, much more relaxed. That's the state I wanted to start. That was my starting point. Once I'd achieved that, sometimes I could do that in 3 breaths, depending on what state of mind I was in. But if I just, you know, had an argument with my other half, or I'd just been doing an intense swimming session and I was still buzzing, sometimes it would take me much, much longer. Okay, so it takes as long as it takes just to get that far. Then the second thing that I would do is I would start to visualize the competition environment. I would start to immerse myself in it. I would imagine that I was in a World Cup environment where there were international athletes all around me, coaches, audience. There were noises. You know, almost that smell you get in the hall that I was likely to be in. So all of this, I would imagine, what would happen? My heart rate would go up. And I'd start to tense up. That was good because now I could do something about that. So then once I'd immersed myself in that visualized reality, I'd go back to my breathing and I'd start controlling my breathing. So what I was doing was I was training my psychophysiology. That means that I was training my mind and my body to link up, to be okay with each other, and for my mind to be able to say, you know what, it's okay for you to be focusing on your routine now. You're okay, you're safe. So then once I'd calmed down in the competition environment, then I would have visualized me stepping up and going through my full competition routine. Sometimes I'd visualize all 20 shots, which would take me close to half an hour. I would get up and I might only practice 20 shots for real, whereas before I'd be practicing 70 shots. So anyway, this was the routine that I went through, and it transformed my performance in competition. I went from coming last in a World Cup to actually winning the shooting at a World Cup 1 year later, having adopted this technique. I felt completely at home in competition. I still felt nervous, but I was totally in control of what I was doing. I enjoyed every single shot. And for me, it was a profound experience, and visualization was definitely central to that experience.
Okay, so how do you then take it from what you're doing to teaching my mate Mark in Vesta's Cox 4 in 2009?
Yeah, I think it's about just working out what their performance is and what it means, and what is it they need to visualize. You see, as we've already spoken about the idea that visualization is something you do when you've already done a few other things. One is you are calm and you're relaxed and you are visualizing in the state of mind that you want to do that skill in, whether that's in training or in competition. The other thing is that you actually know what you're trying to visualize. For someone like Mark, you know, the whole beauty of doing this one-page essay on the perfect race was that it really challenged them as to whether they did know what a good race looked like. Because if you don't even know that, if you can't describe it, if you can't use words to describe the visualized reality of that race, you're never going to have a consistent mental recall for that race. You're never going to have a blueprint. And if your blueprint changes every time, it's no wonder we lose confidence. It's no wonder we suddenly react differently, because suddenly, I don't know, the starter says that you've got to wait on the start line for a bit longer. And you don't have a blueprint to come back to. It's almost like you're making the rules up as you go along. And it's a very nervy place to be that, isn't it? It's a very uncomfortable place to find yourself in. So I think we've already done a lot of stuff before ever getting to the point of visualization. But ultimately, you know, visualization for any sport should be made simple. Johnny Wilkinson did a lot of visualization for rugby. And a lot of people say to me, I've had rugby players say to me, well, yeah, okay, I get this whole visualization stuff, but you can't exactly visualize a whole rugby match. And no, of course you can't. And you don't need to visualize a rugby match, but you can visualize set plays. You can visualize the very anchors of that match that determine whether it leads you down one course or the other. You can visualize, you know, if you're the hooker throwing in, you can visualize the perfectly straight throw, hitting your marker precisely. You can visualize being able to do simple things really well when you're knackered, when your muscles are screaming. You can visualize yourself being able to put in a sprint. You can visualize being able to adopt do the perfect tackle. So you can start to train the different elements of your brain by focusing on one thing at a time. And over time, all these elements come together. And before you know it, you're using these unconscious anchors, because they become unconscious, and that's the point. You're using these unconscious anchors to make your game more predictably good, if that makes sense.